Well, I certainly responded very powerfully to the film for two reasons. First, because I love the Rolling Stones, and I think that's my favorite song ever. And I found myself watching that and having a hard time, even though the song is about war. It does end with love. I mean, if you follow the song through to the end, the last, I think, verse is about love. It seemed out of sync in the sense, in my personal associations with the song, with the images, which I'm also completely familiar with. And so my question is this. I think that really pointed out to me that there's a very strong generational component, as well as the potential conflict or complementarity between images and music or the surrounding input, sensory input. And how do you think, what is the effect of historical and generational change on the power of each of these mediums and also their relationship to each other, that is images and sounds?
Yeah, well, actually, Bill and I went back and back and forth about whether or not to show these separately or to show them together, and we decided in the end to hit you with it. I think that there is a dissonance between the two tools of mediation, but I think that in this particular technological moment, the capacity to separate them out is a purist response to what's going on in the information environment. And I would use that as the same answer to the question of generational memory. When I show these pictures to my students, none of whom have the generational memory, they've all seen them on the internet. They've seen them as posters. They've seen them as anti-war propaganda. They've seen them as record covers. So they have seen them in different contexts that I would argue speaks as much to them in their own lexicon as these spoke to us who were alive during the Vietnam War. And I think the same thing one could argue goes with music.
Yeah, I would add that they are out of sync partly because they were chosen by different people, but for different sorts of messages. Part of that is a public and private idea of mediation. That when I was talking about mediation, I'm talking a lot about the networks that happen on the two sides of mediation. I didn't talk much about the production side, but certainly on the reception side, that new technologies like the phonograph or the cassette recorder in the 60s and 70s affect the way people interact privately. And that for me, that the connection of that song to those images was about the private experience of soldiers. Now, for those of us of that generation, certainly the relationship between that music and those images is very strong, and I think happened in very complex ways. That insofar as those pictures and that music somehow personifies or identifies those of us coming of age in that period, you know, it's a powerful relationship. But in some sense, I think we wanted a bit of a tension between the images and the picture. But I think it would also mean that the relationship between the pictures and the images would be very different for people of different generations. I think one of the complaints that I have about recent imagery about that era is that everything gets globbed together, that the hippies and the political activists and the drugs and so forth are all sort of seen as a coherent whole, whereas those of us that lived through it we're aware of also a lot of the differences in different kinds of experiences that now get lobbed together as the, quote, 60s.
Okay, I have a comment on is this, is it, yeah, it is, on each of the presentations about the music and the images. I went to a conference once on Vietnam and the arts. I was speaking at this conference. It was in the mid-'80s when veterans in large numbers were first starting to come to these kinds of conferences. And one of the things that was interesting to me is that the session on music generated the most participation from the audience of anything else. And I think that that's because people's memories were attached to the music in a very special way. But I think putting the music and the images together is definitely a remediation, right? I mean, this is not how it was experienced at the time. People don't associate the music with watching the news, you know, or seeing these pictures in the news. They associate it with other things. And there's been all of these kinds of remediations of all of those memories later on. So this is one. The other point that I wanted to make, on Barbie's presentation, you were saying that you didn't think that this first kind of mediation that Raymond Williams described applied to journalism, but I think I disagree about that. You know, it seems to me that a journalist has to mediate, for example, in writing a story about autism between the parents of kids who really believe that vaccines cause it and the experts who say it doesn't. A journalist has to mediate between conflicting accounts of an event, you know, between the view of their sources and the skepticism of the audience, between different elements of the audiences. And I would say that that kind of mediation between different actors and points of view in society is just absolutely central to what journalists do. They don't think about it because they're thinking of mediation in the sense of transmitting information to the audience. But this kind of, I guess I would say, ideological mediation, I would say that that's really central to what they do.
Yeah, thanks for that. I actually agree with you. You're right. I think, though, the one way that I would kind of tweak against that is that I think that the kind of mediation along the lines of reconciliation that journalists do supports their own professional, what I was talking about as professional mediation, the claims to objectivity, the claims to the claims to balance, so that this assumption that they can reconcile between different political viewpoints or can reconcile between two source comments always brings us back to that point where they are somehow seen as above critique. By virtue of the fact that they're able to draw from the different sides that they're reconciling. So that, for me, is a little bit more problematic, but I take your point.
I would see this going back to Kathleen's question, and I would make the distinction between private memory and public memory, that what Kathleen brought up in some sense was private memory for people who came of age in that period. And a lot of that private memory revolves around music experiences. I think different people had there are a lot of different kinds of music experiences in that generation, as any generation. And this particular music probably has a lot of resonance for those of us that came of age in that period in terms of our private music experiences, some of which may be, our memory may not be real great because of certain chemical experiences, but certainly that music was imprinted on our brains through private experience. But music has also been a part of public memory. That when the students that we have now, they've seen those images. Many of them, I expect a lot of the times they've seen those images with a soundtrack. And that soundtrack becomes part of the public memory about that period. And so I think it's not that the public and private memories are inseparable. I think they're very much related. But I think we need to distinguish analytically between different kinds of memories and the way that images fit together into some sort of larger meaning.
I have the mic, so I just have a comment. I found this really intriguing. When the Rolling Stones started to play, I wanted to get up and dance. And then the images started to come, and that mobilized, all of my old outrage, and, I wanted to go demonstrate. And when you said that this was something that the Rolling Stones were popular among soldiers in Vietnam, all I could think of is, and they were totally popular for anti-war activists here. So one of the things that I'm curious about is how different, not just individuals, but different constituencies are able to utilize a somewhat common culture, certainly a more common popular culture available then than seems to be available now, to really enact very different
networks of who went and where. One of the things that was new about the Vietnam War compared to other wars, new for soldiers, was the way that the culture back home was mediated to them. That in earlier wars, the earliest wars, if you go way back, it would just be the culture they brought and they might have shared. So in World War I, it was not uncommon for soldiers to sing together, and they probably would have been singing songs that they knew before. World War II, you had the Armed Forces radio, and so they were listening to Glenn Miller and people like that, some country music, but it was mediated through the hierarchy of the military. Vietnam was the first war in which they were able to have a technology that they could control and that they could bring the content for. And the cassette player, was a very important technology for the way that they listened to music and the kind of connection that they would have had to the culture back home. So I think it's very important that the relationship between culture among the soldiers and the culture back home was mediated by a new technology.
If I can just say to Gail, I think you've hit on exactly the power of mediation, which is the fact that because mediation can never be a one-on-one correspondence with experience, it's the noise that enters into the message in all of the points where it differs from experience that people can activate in different ways. And it's not an accident that images and music tend to be used by totally divergent parties. These same images both were used by anti-war activists and by conservatives. So, there's an absolute continuum of people who look at these and can use them for their own aims, and that is why mediation is so powerful.